is about, and I will record it so that the world will then learn that we're like the Bilderberg group. We meet in this small room and decide the economic fate of the world, including the wretched of the earth. All right. Last thing about voting, you need to decide in terms of registration, if you're going to vote, and say you're from California, and there's some sort of initiative on the ballot that you're concerned about, and you want to vote on that, you can't also vote in Oregon. Make sure that you're registered in California. I think that's what Everett was trying to explain, is that you can verify whether or not you're registered by contacting the Secretary of State's office for either California or Oregon, depending on where you want to be or think you are registered. Okay, they'll be able to search that. The Secretary of State's office website for Oregon has a specific function that will tell you whether or not you're currently registered, and if so, where you are, in Oregon. Okay, but just to make sure that you understand that it's not legal to vote either in a state or a national election from more than one place. Not only more than one state, but more than one house or more than one district. You can only be registered in one place. Okay, so that's important. All right. Now, last time, you may recall, in our last exciting adventure, we talked about industrialization and urbanization. What I was trying to suggest in that discussion was that those were two of a series of trends that are legitimately global in nature. They involve a whole sweep of history, of significant events and transformations of technology and social formation and culture and language and everything. Okay, and these are phenomena that affect the entire world, however unevenly. Ultimately, they do. Does anybody have any questions about our discussions, either of industrialization or urbanization, and what we talked about? And I heard a noise. Was it a no or a, okay, I see. Eddie Van Halen's dead. I can't help it, okay? There's nothing I can do about that. Now, then let's move on. When the term secularization is used, how do you understand that word? I'm hoping that at least some of you took a look at the reading, but when people talk about the process of secularizing, or that something is secular, what do they mean?
Does it mean not for religious use?
Yeah, in the sense that we're talking about, it means it's not religious. It doesn't mean it's anti-religious. It means it's not religious. It doesn't involve it or require religious faith. Okay, give me an example of something that we would generally describe as secular. You're in the middle of one of those processes right now.
The separation of church and state?
Well, the separation of church and state, first of all, it isn't as nearly as clear in the Constitution as people think, if you're thinking of the United States. But what I was thinking more of is something that is by definition secular. Saying there's church and state is preserving a place for religion. Yeah, Ricky.
Like education, since we're going to a school that's not specifically Christian or religious at all, I mean.
Yeah, unless you are going to a religious institution and involved in what is sometimes referred to as faith-based learning, then education generally has been a secularizing force. Okay, now, so the question then is, what does this have to do outside the United States? I mean, clearly, most of the rest of the world is religious and everything else. What we found is that no, in fact, again, this is like both industrialization and urbanization. This is a trend that's been moving along slowly for centuries. Okay. That is, the more that we've developed other techniques to help us really explain the world rather than simply in sort of complex ways say we don't know. In other words, we decide we actually do know. What we're doing is, we're essentially secularizing our understanding of the world. We no longer say when we see lightning, oh, that's a pissed off God throwing something at us. Or, someone dies, we're less likely today to say, well, why did that happen? I don't know, it's God's will. I mean, that's not good enough for a secular person. But we know what causes cancer. Okay, we know what causes heart disease. We know why people die, and we don't need to just fall back on the idea of that which is unknowable becomes an article of faith. It used to be that the assumption about the world was there were mysteries we couldn't solve, and there were things about the world that we could observe but not know what caused them. And that's when we started to develop the notion of, sort of supernatural forces and then more importantly of supernatural agency. That is, these aren't just abstract natural forces. These are forces that are sentient, they're thinking, they're self-aware, and they're involved in our lives. Okay, that's a relatively modern thing in human history. Well, we've continued to move along this general trajectory where increasingly we're finding that as people industrialize, as they urbanize, and as there more and more people acquire literacy and education, the notion of religious faith becomes less important to their lives. And remember, we're not talking about people opposing religion. We're talking about people who simply don't connect with religion. Okay, because one of the things about the rise of science as a way of understanding the world is that it encourages skepticism. Okay, religion does not. Indeed, most religions punish skepticism, or they hold it up as a test of faith. Okay, but ultimately, for religious dogma to work, particularly in the main three desert religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the idea is you have to have faith. Okay, ultimately you do. If you reject faith, then you are outside the religion. And indeed, you may be a heretic, you may be persecuted for that. Any number of bad things may happen. Okay, science doesn't do that. Science doesn't say to anyone, look, if you don't believe in evolution, we're going to, a dinosaur is going to come and get you. Okay, what it says is probably what you're really saying is you don't yet understand revolution as a way of explaining the origin and changes in the species on the planet. Okay, that's okay, and it's sort of accepted, right? But it encourages skepticism. Here's, a lot of people, I still hear this to this day, where people will say, well, there's no real difference between religion and science. They both just involve believing in things. No, they don't. Not at all. Nothing could be further from the truth, okay? The thing about science is a process of acquiring understanding of the material phenomena of the world by observing, recording, and analyzing phenomena, and then trying to explain them with reference to recognizable patterns of activity, behavior, phenomena, okay? And so then you develop what's called a theory. But the thing about theory building, unlike religious dogma, theory building only works if the theory is falsifiable, okay? No theory is a theory unless there's a possibility that it could be wrong. That is, that subsequent understandings might reveal that what we thought was the best explanation for something proves not to be accurate or not to be adequate. In other words, Newtonian physics is not inaccurate as far as it goes, but it's inadequate to explain all of the intricate phenomena we associate now with the physical world. So that's where, Einstein comes into in other words, Einstein doesn't say, forget about Newton and those laws of thermodynamics and things, they don't work. They work as far as they go, okay? But they don't go far enough because we understand and can discover more about the world. But at every step of that, every theory that's advanced is subject constantly and relentlessly to testing and the possibility of falsifiability. That is, it might be wrong, let's keep testing it. So evolution is not just a belief, okay? Evolution is absolutely and by far the best explanation human beings have ever developed for the origin and development of species on the planet. There is no competing explanation that accounts more consistently with what we can observe, okay? But religion is not a part of that. Now, it doesn't mean, in fact, just the opposite. Religion and science can coexist in the mind of a single individual. And of course they do. There are religious scientists who are, I mean, one of the most brilliant anthropologists, archaeologists I had as a professor, this guy by the name of Frank Bayham, was at the time, he was in, I think, his first or second year, just fresh out of graduate school. He was a fascinating instructor, just a naturally, organically good teacher, and a brilliant scientist. He was also a practicing Catholic. Okay. And I remember asking him, and first thing that I noticed was he wasn't offended by the question. But I asked him, I said, is there ever a time when you find that, your mind is crowded by trying to accommodate both your Catholic faith and the skepticism of your science? And his response to that was something along the lines of, absolutely not. I know what you're asking, and that makes sense to me. He said that his religious faith never once intruded on his ability to be a good scientist, because for him, science was about what we could know. Religion was about all the rest. And so he said, over time, as he evolved intellectually, right, he found that he understood how to explain more and more and more of the observable phenomena of the world, but it didn't weaken his religious faith, it just focused it. Zachary.
It's almost like humans have made a full 180, because it used to be science needs to prove itself to religion, but now your religion needs to prove itself to science.
No, I would say that's inaccurate completely, with all respect. I think you're half right. There was a period of time, I would say it was the Middle Ages, where science kind of, in order for scientists not to be burned at the stake, had somehow to prove its legitimacy so that, science could prevail, which ultimately it did. But science has no interest at all in proving or disproving religion. Zero, none. No responsible scientist is involved in the enterprise of proving or disproving the existence of God. It simply doesn't show up. It's not there. Because the idea is, there's a concession by any responsible scientist that at any given time, there are just things we don't yet understand. If people want to refer those things to a supernatural agency of some kind, that's fine, unless we do know why those things happen, in which case, that is not any longer the best response we have. Here's the challenge of religion. Religion doesn't really explain anything. That's not what it's for. Okay, religion does not tell us why things happen. It really doesn't. Religion teaches us how to accept and live with those things. Okay, the fundamental challenges of just, dealing with life, and more importantly, of course, of dealing with what we know is waiting for us in terms of our own mortality. Science doesn't help some people with that. Religion can, okay? Because again, it's an unknown. Science cannot tell you what happens after we die, okay? Religion can't either. They can make up stories, but there's no sense that, well, no, we did some research and we've gone and we've come back and we're telling you this is what's there. That's not how science works, or how religion works. What religion says really is, please don't be afraid. Well, that's okay. That's a nice thing to do, to try and convince people not to fear death. One of the critiques of religion, and one of the reasons why particularly your generation all over the world is moving away from religion, is that people began to grow suspicious of something that seemed only to offer reward or security or safety or dignity after you died, okay? And for a lot of people, that's just not enough. It's like, wait a minute, no, I got to deal with life right now. Don't tell me how good things are going to be when I die. I got to take care of my family, or I need a job, or I need healthcare, or I need whatever. And just telling me, don't worry about that, because when you die, you're going to inherit the kingdom of heaven. It's like, well, look, I can't think about the kingdom of heaven right now. I'm hungry. Okay. And for some people, that becomes a problem. And if you're looking at the situation right now, not everybody's going to respond to a religious appeal to have faith. It just isn't going to sustain you. And the more science sort of intrudes upon our understanding of the world by trying to explain it in good faith, right? But not merely as a belief system, but as something that's falsifiable and verifiable. All right, religion really is less necessary. And this is why one of the common assumptions is the more education you have, okay, again, the more secular education you have, the more secular you will become in your orientation toward the world. Now, if you look at the article there, and you don't have to do it right now, but check it out, and it says more education, less religion. This is a sociologist who is sort of saying, yeah, not so much. That in fact, he's trying to argue that higher levels of education can actually influence Americans' religious beliefs and activities, but not in the way we thought. That is, people with more education might actually be more religious. Read that carefully, though, and look at the way that religion is defined. Okay, belief in an afterlife can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. If you just can't envision your existence ever stopping, you essentially by default believe in an afterlife. That's not the same thing as being religious, because what you're not doing is looking for a supernatural explanation, right? You're not looking for a supernatural comfort or something like that. Hence, you are not really religious. So the point that's missed for me in that article, although I think it's a valuable read and it gets us thinking about how education and religion, in fact, coexist, is the idea that globally, yes, human beings are secularizing, and they're secularizing all over the world. All over the world, we can see that people just simply, in larger numbers and generally younger, just simply do not embrace religion as important to their lives. Now, it isn't a critical mass, it isn't a majority, but it's more than we've seen in modern recorded history, okay? And so the trend is very slowly and very gradually toward more secularism. As we industrialize, as we urbanize, and as we come to rely more and more on the things that we learn as a consequence of science, religion just simply, the space for religion begins to contract. But another part of that is, and this is what a lot of opponents of science these days, miss, is it doesn't eliminate religion. It actually focuses religion on the things that are most problematic to people, the things we really can't quite know. And the ultimate big one is mortality. Science can't help us there. Well, if what you need is reassurance, and let's face it, just to get through the day, sometimes you do, for a lot of people, that's religion. That's enough. And it becomes more important the older you get. I made a kind of a snide remark early in the class without even thinking that I said you get to a certain age where you just stop caring, and you do. But, it's like there's very things. I mean, like waking up this morning and hearing that Eddie Van Halen died of cancer. And it's like, first of all, I was sure that he was younger than me. He's like a couple, 3 years older than me. But it's like, yeah, you get to this age, you start losing your friends. You start losing people. And for a lot of people, that you then look for something to reassure you, because you feel like the ground's kind of unsteady under your feet. So a lot of you might right now have little or no use for religion, but watch what happens when you turn 50 or 60. And some of you are going to go back and revisit faith in some way. What this kind of secularizing trend suggests, though, is you won't necessarily go back and convert to Judaism or become a Catholic or something like that. But what you might be is more inclined to do research and reading in spiritualism of some kind or something like that. I watched my father, right, who was never a believing Christian, not an atheist, but just for whom religion was never important. But, the dude's almost 100. He's 96. So most of his time is spent reading things about alternate states of thinking and being and all that, because he's a really smart guy. And he needs that brain to go somewhere. But every morning he's dealing with his own mortality, right? And so it's not quite religious. It's much more secular than what that same man would have done 50 years ago, is what I'm saying. It's a fascinating thing to see, because it reassures him that, hey, man, you'll figure this out. Sooner or later, you'll figure it out. And it gets him through the day. I think that's fine. I mean, not that my opinion matters, but it reassures me that my old man has a way of getting through the day that science can't solve. Science is keeping him alive. He's got a pacemaker and all this other stuff and all these, these chemicals in him and everything else, to keep him alive. But Science can't reassure him about what's going to happen when the pacemaker and the chemicals stop working. Okay, does that make sense? Well, what I want you to do is take a look at those two articles and give some thought to that, kind of, well, where are you in all this? Where are you in terms of, your own sense of your trust in science? Not that everything science produces is good. That's not what I'm talking about. And we know that, the kinds of technologies we derive from scientific inquiry can do tremendous harm to the planet, to the species, okay, in a lot of different ways, not just materially. But overall, we couldn't, for example, be doing what we're doing right now absent science. We've tamed electricity, okay? We've done a lot of extraordinary things that allow us to keep this university going, even though nature has thrown us something that, is dangerous and certainly discouraging, human beings to kind of group together in the ways we're otherwise prone to do, okay? So think about that notion of secularization as a trend and think about what your own reaction to that is. Are there any questions about secularization? What we mean by that? There's some data there that will show you what's happening around the world. Some of it I think will surprise you. Okay, anything else on secularization? All right. The only other one I really wanted to talk about today, I'm going to leave deindustrialization for next week, I think. Let me just kind of step out of character just for a second here and ask you, do you understand what I try to do here? Is I try not to give you, it's not that I just want to get in here and get out of here. I could do this for hours, but I try to watch your reactions and things and sense, you know what, I think their heads are full now. I think it's time to move on. Okay. I'm not trying to rush this. I'm trying to reinforce, for example, that we have plenty of time to do this stuff. And so what I want to do is make sure that when we look at these concepts, they're important. Let's spend as much time as we need to on them. This is going to become more important really beginning in the next module, when you'll notice, if you sneak ahead there, that some of those readings are quite a bit longer and somewhat more complex. Okay. Don't worry about it. We'll have all the time we need. Okay. And if you encounter like the readings we're looking at now, or it probably will start beginning in week 5, and those readings, if you're not comfortable asking questions in class or in chat because it's got your name on it, just send me an email. And if you want to have a Zoom meeting and you want to like talk about this stuff individually or anything like that, that's fine, right? There's in the chat, anyone who's ever died and was brought back to life. I'm sorry, I just missed that. It went away. Let me look at that. Because, okay, anyone who has ever died and I think been brought back to life can tell what the spirit life is all about. Actually, no, you can't. And here's why. Those are completely subjective experiences. Okay, completely subjective. That is, there's no verifiable way to know that every individual would have the same experience, or that what you're seeing is in fact spiritual life. What it is, and I think that was the point there, was that there's a personal perspective that everyone has. Okay, what that suggests is that there's a part of every human being that is kind of intrinsically faith-based in some way. It won't work, the mechanism doesn't work the same for everyone. But my understanding is that what Patricia is suggesting here is that it can reveal to you a certain experience or perspective that might, to your satisfaction, provide the explanation you need. Okay, that is true. That's very true. That's a fundamental psychological phenomenon that human beings face in different ways. And not just, it doesn't have to be just, literally the idea of facing your own mortality, but stress-related incidents and things like that. First of all, they stimulate all kinds of really fascinating neurochemical activity because your body's constantly trying to help your brain deal with what you're encountering every day. Okay, and that's a full-time job. That mechanism's working real hard for you, and it's doing it all day. That's why those dreams are as weird as they are. But you're right in the sense that what people often, for example, what people often describe as religious visions, okay? No, we could say they are. Again, it's a question of faith, right? But a scientist is going to come along and say, well, that might be what people call a religious vision, but here's what we know about it. We know that it's a consequence of this kind of neurochemical activity in your body. So it's a material phenomenon. But your experience of it can very well be what you would describe as spiritual. This is what I mean when I say that science and religion can coexist. Science can, beyond a certain point, is going to say, you know what? Yeah, I can't observe the phenomena you're talking about. I'm going to concede to you. What you experienced is what you experienced. A responsible scientist is going to do that. But the problem is science requires what's called generalizability. That is, any explanation has to be generalizable. It can't just work for some people, but not for others. It has to be a generalizable way of explaining some sort of observable phenomenon of some kind. The difference is a faith or spiritual experience is personal and subjective, okay? But it doesn't mean we don't have them. I'm going to give you a really stupid idea to think about. And this, I'm almost embarrassed to admit this because it sounds so new agey and phony and everything, but I've been playing music on and off. I started late, so I didn't start till I was 18, all right? But I absolutely immersed myself in it. And I went years and years and years without being able to pick a single instrument. And so I was just obsessed with instruments. But when I started playing again seriously, when I was about 50, I really started playing guitar seriously. And I actually experienced this thing that I heard other musicians talk about, where there are times, and I know it sounds silly, and again, this is a completely subjective, non-verifiable experience, where you'll hear musicians talk about, I wasn't playing the instrument, it was playing me. Okay, I don't know how many of you play an instrument, but once you've acquired a certain facility on the instrument, I call it functional mastery. That is, if I can hear it, I can play it. When you reach that point, you do, and I play a lot of improvisational music, right? So you're really kind of leaning into inspiration. There will be times when I'm actually consciously sitting back and listening to what mind and hand are doing. Okay, I can't explain that scientifically. And I think that's what Patricia was, what I'm trying to say is it has nothing to do with mortality, but it is tantamount to a spiritual experience. This from someone with absolutely no interest in, not only do I not have religious faith, I have no interest in it. But I do know that there are experiences and states of mind, albeit subjective, that I can't explain just neurologically, scientifically. It doesn't mean there isn't an explanation for them. It means I don't know what it is and I don't care. Because when you feel that, you just write it out. It's kind of like surfing. You just write it out. And some of the best playing I've ever done has been in that state of mind. So I hope I'm not being misunderstood as trivializing those subjective experiences. What I'm saying is we have to accept, though, that they're not generalizable. We can't be sure that other people would experience that moment in the same way, whether it is, surviving that car accident or, playing the most phenomenal version of John Coltrane's Naima anyone could ever imagine and not knowing what you just did. And the best you can do is drink a beer and enjoy the fact that you are capable of that. Yeah. I'm sorry, Zachary, do you have your hand up? Go ahead, Bill.
Isn't that basically part of the human experience is this can be explained or this can't be explained, but it's what I believe in. I've been a Norse pagan for 3 years, and things that have happened to me, they mean a lot to me. And someone could say, well, I can't explain it, but I'm sure there's an explanation for it. But isn't part of the human experience going, I have faith in this and it makes me happy?
Well, I think it can be. I think there is a thing in humans because we have these restless, relentless minds that are trying constantly, as I say, to make sense of what we're observing. And a lot of that is just incomprehensible gibberish, okay? But we have these mechanisms built in or learned and wired into us through years of repetition that help us cope with uncertainty, okay? In my political science 201 class, I talk about the importance of institutions. That is, these recognizable, observable patterns of behavior that recur. And as they do, we come to learn what's expected of us and what to expect subsequently. A component of that is something like what Zachary's talking about is, you find subjectively, okay, I observe these states of mind or I observe these states of being. And at certain times they're more common or they're more profound or they're more emphatic, okay? And then I've kind of come to understand that, at least for me, what that means is this, okay? You don't need science for that. And human beings do that all the time. And it is, again, think of it as It's a coping mechanism, right? How do you cope with uncertainty? Religious faith can be wonderful at doing that, because what it's not saying is, let me tell you why that happens. What it's really saying is, just keep going, don't worry. You can cope with this. You can absolutely cope with this. You know, that's why when I hear people, like some of the most repellent human beings I've ever known are militant atheists, because their whole idea is it's not just enough for them not to believe, they want to strip other people of their belief. And this is a personal opinion, okay? So if you're a militant atheist, I'm not trying to attack you, but I'm trying to be honest, okay? To me, it's like taking innocent belief away from a child. And I don't mean that to be condescending. That's what gets that kid through the day. I grew up during the most dangerous period of the Cold War. For my generation, you come to find out that some studies have been done on this. There was one recurring nightmare that kids my age had. And I had it several times as a kid, okay, where I would wake up and be completely alone in the house, and it'd be absolutely quiet, okay? And I'd know right away that something was wrong and that something had happened, okay? And I'd find my way through the house, and everything would kind of seem familiar, but no one was there. And, you know, we always had a dog. The dog wasn't there. And I'd either go to a window or go to the door, and I'd look outside, and in the far distance see this huge explosion, and then wake up. That's the Cold War. Because, you know, I lived in a place at that time in Sacramento where there were 2 Air Force bases that were part of Strategic Air Command. They were targeted by the Soviets for absolute annihilation. Okay. And my parents were kind of aware of that. So every day they had to get up, send each of us to a different school, right? And then go to work themselves. Imagine being a parent, having that in the back of your mind, right? And then thinking, if that bomb drops, how do I find my kids? And that's the way we grew up. And we all had different coping mechanisms for that. We all had different ways of getting through the day. Okay. And a lot of that might have been whistling in the dark. But you know what? Sometimes that's all you can do, because it's hard for me to explain to you now and for you to understand. This was not seen as a distant possibility. We were sure this was going to happen. When I was a little kid, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, I still remember, because we were going to the movies and had to turn around and come back, and they had to find a way to explain to us why. Okay? And they had to lie. What were they going to do? You know, well, you know, there are Russian missiles, you know, 90 miles from Florida. If those missiles are launched, and they might be, we're all going to die horribly. You know? Do you want to tell that to a kid? Well, I think that's what religion and faith of different kinds, spiritualism, do for us. Is maybe they're not the perfect explanation, but, you know, sometimes that paralyzing fear just has to be pushed back a little bit. So there's an important component of this and this is why I think we'll never completely secularize, because, and I think Zachary was suggesting this, and so I believe was Patricia, there's always a part of us that has to cope with immediate uncertainty. And if something happens in our lives that science doesn't immediately account for, our brains are going to fill in the gaps. They're really good at that. And it doesn't mean we're lying to ourselves. It just means that's a subjective understanding of something I can't otherwise make sense of. That's important. So that's what I mean. We have this trend toward secularization, but we're not this isn't a war against religion. That's not what it is. It's just that we know more about the world, and sometimes we kid ourselves into thinking we've got it all figured out. So that's what I mean. But clearly I'm keeping Marion away because she's yawning over there, and she's clearly had enough. So let's move on. What about globalization? You hear this, everybody's always flapping on about globalization. What are they talking about? What's globalization? What do they mean? Why do we keep talking about globalization? We always do. What does it mean? I don't want to talk about globalization. I'm tired of globalization. I just want to play guitar. Damn it. Come on, people use the term globalization. What do you what's the picture in your head?
I think it's the connection of trade throughout the world, the economy.
an important component of globalization has always been economic. It's the engine of globalization really is economic. The engine of empire and colonialism is economic. It's not race, it's not religion, it's wealth and economy. And in that idea of connection is the key. What I would understand globalization is an expansion in the density and complexity of interdependence. Okay, that is, globalization is the expansion of a people toward another people, people from one geographic area of the world toward another, in ways that compel them to connect and interconnect and become interdependent. Okay, in other words, think about the globalization of the economy, not merely as, well, there's a bunch of people getting rich, but try and think about it this way. I hate to keep, okay, it's Eddie Van Halen died. I'm thinking about guitars today, but I think this is not a bad example. If you walked into that room over there, first of all, you would see somebody. Oops. But in addition to that, you would see, you'd see a guitar from Indonesia, at least one guitar from China, a guitar from the United States, a guitar from Ensenada, Mexico, really nice Stratocaster. Okay, you would see an amplifier from China, a Marshall amplifier from Vietnam, a Victory amplifier from the UK, and a Quilter solid state amplifier from the United States. Okay, now that's globalism. Okay, that's globalization, because what we've done is we've globalized the factory floor that allows people to produce music inexpensively. Okay, it's not just, well, the Chinese make really great stuff. No, the Chinese make, when they want to, very high quality, durable finished goods at affordable prices for the American middle class, because Americans can't. We don't get paid high enough wages in this country for most of us to afford the durable goods that our own country produces. Only wealthy Americans usually can do that. But we can still enjoy a lot of the perquisites of being middle class because China and Vietnam and Indonesia and, whatever, Bangladesh making a lot of our clothing or whatever, they work much more cheaply. Okay, so those are, in other words, the survival of the American middle class is dependent upon the relatively reduced cost of production in the rest of the world. That's a complex interdependence. That did not exist when I was a kid. If you'd walked into our house during that Cold War period I was talking about, when that little kid was having bad dreams, you'd have had trouble finding anything there that wasn't made in the United States. Okay? And now it would be difficult to find things in my house that were made in the United States because I'm not rich. And I put 2 kids through college. It's expensive. I got a lot of debt. That's American. So it's this idea, when you think of globalization, one of the things to think about is complex interdependence that transcends space. Okay. And there are different ways to think about it. What Patricia started this with was the broad-based globalization of economic relations. Okay. But you can kind of delve into that more deeply. Okay. You can think about the globalization of information. Okay. This has been happening for a long time, but like everything else, it seems to be accelerating as we advance technologically in some certain trajectory, right? That is, I can right now, and I will later today, be in contact with people in at least 2 parts of the world that are no closer than 7,000 miles away, okay? I guess it was a couple of weekends ago, right? Recorded 2 tracks of music for someone who is doing an EP in London. I've never met this person. I've never seen them. They now have 2 tracks of stuff that I played. Okay, that is the globalization of information, because music to me is information. Okay, if we were talking, and we could be, and you weren't in and around, Southern Oregon, but in fact, you were in, Ensenada, Mexico, or you were in Manila in the Philippines or whatever, we would be globalizing information. The point is, we can establish networks and interconnections by which we can transmit and receive information at a global level now. There are obstacles to that, the censorship imposed by China on the internet, things like that. The fact that when Americans watch news, right, there is a different CNN that the rest of the world gets. It's called CNN International. And then there's CNN that we get. Look at how seldom Americans get news of the world. And when we do, you know what it is? It's when it's a catastrophe. Otherwise, we don't get news of the world. If you want to find out what's going on, if you want to enjoy the benefits of globalizing information, you almost have to step outside the United States. You have to use Al Jazeera. You have to use, one of the wire services. You have to use the BBC. Okay. But those opportunities are there. We're globalizing information. I mean, you can say that it started with the perfection of travel across oceans, and it was refined by the mechanization of that travel so that we're no longer subject to currents and wind. Okay. Then it was the development of the telegraph, and then the sinking of the Atlantic cable so that we can transmit almost literally at light speed coded information that we can understand that will tell us, here's what's happening in London right now. Okay, you fast forward to the creation of the internet, passing over air travel, automobiles and trucks, all kinds of things. You are, not only are you globalizing commerce, but you're globalizing information. Okay, you're increasing the availability, the complexity, you're collapsing the size and scope limitations. Okay, that's what globalization is. And so what I liked about the globalization article there, it's a little bit long. I encourage you merely to skim it, but it was the best concise history of globalization that would show you, first of all, this isn't a late 20th century, early 21st century phenomenon. This has been with us since we settled into civilizations. Remember when we were talking about the beginnings of urbanization being the first time human beings settled in permanent cities and domesticated agriculture? Shortly after that, we began globalizing because we could. Okay? So what I'd like you to do is look at that, and then if you could, and I'm almost ready to let you go. It's not been quite an hour, so we're right about where I like to be. That article on, what is an American automobile? This is a classic example of the goofiness of globalization. How much of an American automobile actually has to be produced by American workers in territorial America for that to be considered American? And what does it even mean anymore to have an American car? I mean, if you drive a Ford, it's just as likely that much of that was produced in either Canada or Mexico because of NAFTA, however renamed it is, okay, as it is actually built in Detroit or something like that, okay? Part of that is, again, because a lot of the I'll get you in 1 second, Patricia, a lot of the American middle class isn't making sufficient wages to be able to afford a car that's made completely in the United States. But if we reduce the cost of parts and labor by sending some of that down to Mexico or maybe into Canada or whatever, it's more affordable for us. I'm sorry, Patricia, you had a comment or question.
Well, I was just confused about that when I read that article, because that was fascinating. But when America says it's American made, they include Mexico and Canada in that dynamics because it's American, North American.
Well, again, and that never, if something said made in USA, I mean, it by law, it had to be made in the United States. One of the really weird things about the 2016 campaign, I don't mean to make fun of Donald Trump. For one thing, it's not fair. It's too easy. But when he had those Make America Great Again hats, there was a kind of minor controversy over the fact that those were produced in China. Even the hats weren't American. But that, I mean, I think it's a cheap shot because, again, as I say, I mean, anything I'm wearing right now, I think this was made in America. I think. Coffee mug, we still make coffee mugs, but my TV, that sound bar that goes with it, all of the electronics for the internet that I'm using to talk to you, none of this was made in the United States. None of it. We're supporting Chinese communism. We really are. We're keeping them afloat. But they're keeping the American middle class. Imagine that as a paradox of globalization. Chinese communism is keeping the American middle class solvent. That's astonishing. Karl Marx did not envision that. Boy, was Karl wrong. He was wrong about a lot of things, but that's profound. I always love that. Yay, communism. Thank God we can afford TVs. You know, if it wasn't for communism, you wouldn't have a smartphone. I mean, there is a certain kind of validity to that, as absurd as it sounds. And of course, it's ultimately, it's, as I say, these are complex interactions. So it's more complex than that. If you bought a Japanese car recently, it might very well have been produced in Tennessee, you know, with American workers. I mean, it doesn't mean anything anymore. But it is good to think about. I'm suggesting it's useful to think about these complex global interdependencies. Yeah, Patricia.
I think that the only car they didn't mention in that article was the Corvette. And I think that's completely, totally made in America.
I don't know.
All the parts, everything.
Yeah, it might be. They may claim that because there's a certain kind of mark that a Corvette has for, like, you know, middle-aged men or whatever. But I don't know if that's true. I have no idea. It might be. It might be. It would be
They
interesting.
didn't mention it in the
Yeah.
article, but
No, it didn't. And I honestly don't, I can't pretend to know. It would be really funny if we found out that even the Corvette, you know, it was, oh no, it's that's a Mexican this and a Canadian that. And, you know, I mean, a Canadian Corvette is almost a contradiction in terms. Because, you know, Canadians are so lovable and polite, and the Corvette is such an obnoxious car that would be like, Canadians making Corvettes? My God, what have we done? Globalization's dangerous. America's a cancer, you know. But anyway, so take a look at, obviously, if you haven't already, take a look at the industrialization and urbanization links. Please don't wait till the last minute to do this stuff. Just try to stay current with the readings. For today, though, just glance over the secularization and the education article there, and then the globalization. Again, skim it. I don't expect everyone to read that top to bottom. You know, if you're serious, for example, about committing yourself to the study of international, you know, all things international, being an international studies major, I would encourage you to spend more time with these readings, because this is what the major looks like. It's this kind of stuff. But I understand if you're just taking this as a class that's interesting to you, you know, I don't want to burn you out. That's okay. But you can skim these articles and get a lot of information from them. And then please remember, if you have any questions, anything that it just doesn't make sense, you know, you don't understand it, if you don't want to talk in class, that's fine, but please do send me an email, because then I'll know. And then in the next class meeting, I will, the only thing I keep notes on is that if people email me, I have a little, like a little note that I set by each class where there have been questions. And I make sure that somehow, without sort of mentioning you or anything else, I just drop those things into the points I'm trying to make on a given day. So I know some people just aren't comfortable, you know, actually publicly participating. I don't want to push you in an area where you're not comfortable, but I do want to be able to respond to your questions. I don't want you to be locked inside your own uncertainty. That's not what higher education should be. Does that make sense what I'm saying? All right. Are there any other questions then before I let you go on your way? And just give a thought to Eddie Van Halen, you know, as you move along. All right, then I will, when will I see you again? I don't know. I guess not till Monday. It's so weird because this week is totally congested and wall to wall for me, and I'm having a hell of a time remembering what I'm supposed to do next, even though it's all written down. Okay, so you got plenty of time to look at that. I am still looking at your last assignments. I got busier this week than I hoped to get, so I'm a little bit behind, and I will admit, some of you maybe have had me before in a class, I'm a fairly slow grader, so I'm doing the best I can. As I mentioned before, if you're concerned about that and you just want to know how you did, I can bump you to the front of the queue, because I haven't done the final grading yet. No, there's a little bit of, that looks like David Lee Roth, who I hate. All right, so I will see you next week. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.